The crystal chandeliers of the Buckhead Country Club in the heart of Atlanta threw a harsh, glittering light across the ballroom. I stood near the heavy oak doors holding a glass of sparkling cider, watching the wealth of the city put on a show. It was my son's wedding day. Marcus was marrying into the family of Reginald, a man who built his entire life on least luxury and loud arrogance. I took a sip of my drink, feeling the chill of the ice against my teeth. My name is Isaiah, and I am not a man who belongs in rooms like this. At least that is what everyone in this room believed. I had arrived exactly 12 minutes late. It was not out of disrespect. One of my commercial refrigerated freight trucks carrying a vital load of medical supplies had broken down on Interstate 285. I had to personally route the replacement fleet because my drivers depend on me. I did not have time to drive home and shower. I changed into my formal suit, an old navy blue two-piece in the back of my dispatch office. There was a smear of dark engine grease on the left cuff of my jacket. I had tried to wipe it away with a damp cloth, but it just settled deeper into the fabric. I stood in the back of the room feeling the heavy, judgmental stares of the bride's family. They were dressed in silk and diamonds and custom tailoring. They looked at me like I'd crawled out of a sewer. A waiter passed by carrying a silver tray of tiny, expensive appetizers. He took one look at my suit and quickly turned the other way. I did not care about the food. I cared about my boy. I looked across the sea of tables searching for Marcus. He was standing near the head table laughing with his new groomsmen. He wore a pristine white tuxedo paid for by the very checking account he thought was an insurance payout. He did not look in my direction. He did not come over to shake my hand or ask how my drive was. He just blended into the crowd of people who thought they owned the world. Reginald, the father of the bride, was holding court near the center of the room. He was a loud man with a fake smile and a watch that cost more than a reliable car. He spotted me standing by the doors. He whispered something to his wife, a woman dripping in rented pearls, and they both let out a sharp, mocking laugh. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I kept my face perfectly still. I've spent 40 years building an empire from a single tow truck. I know how to weather a storm. I know how to let a fool talk until he digs his own grave. A woman in a sparkling silver dress brushed past me, bumping my shoulder hard. "Watch where you are standing," she snapped. She looked at my grease-stained cuff and wrinkled her nose in absolute disgust. "This area is for invited guests, not the cleaning staff," she added before walking away. I took a slow, deep breath. The music swelled, a live string quartet, playing a classical piece I could not name. I was a mechanic, a man with calloused hands and a tired back. That was the story they told themselves. That was the camouflage I wore. They saw a tired, broken old man from the south side of town. They did not see the owner of a logistics empire that moved billions of dollars in freight across the entire eastern seaboard. They did not see the man who had secretly purchased the very country club we were standing in just 2 weeks prior. I stood in my own building wearing a dirty suit, letting them insult me. The trap was already set and they were walking right into it, smiling all the way. I took another sip of my cider, waiting for the speeches to begin. I saw Kendra, the bride, glaring at me from the main table. She leaned over to Marcus, pointing a manicured finger in my direction. Marcus looked at me, his face flushing red with embarrassment. He actually turned his back to me, pretending he did not see his own father standing alone in the shadows. The disrespect was a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. I reached into my pocket, feeling the thick, textured paper of the wedding gift I had prepared. It was a certified bank draft for $500,000, a foundation for their new life. I rubbed the edge of the envelope with my thumb, wondering if they actually deserved a single penny of it. The room grew quiet as the band stopped playing and someone tapped a microphone. It was time for the toasts, and the real humiliation was about to begin. The room went entirely silent as the clinking of champagne glasses faded away. Kendra, looking like a magazine cover in her custom gown, stepped up to the microphone at the head table. The spotlight swung over to her, catching the blinding sparkle of the diamond necklace that her father claimed he bought. She smiled a wide, practiced smile and thanked her parents for their endless generosity. She called Reginald her rock, the epitome of class and absolute success. Then her smile dropped into a cruel smirk, and she turned her cold eyes toward the back of the ballroom. "And we absolutely cannot forget my new father-in-law, Isaiah," she said, her voice dripping with venom. The spotlight swung rapidly across the room, leaving the beautiful head table and blinding me in the shadows. I blinked against the harsh light, keeping my posture straight, refusing to cower. "There he is, everyone," Kendra announced, pointing her manicured finger right at my grease-stained suit. "Please excuse the smell of motor oil and desperation because he works in a dirty garage somewhere on the south side." The entire room of 400 elite guests erupted into laughter. It was not polite, gentle laughter. It was a roaring, mocking sound tearing through the elegant space. I honestly stopped listening when he talks about his day. Kendra continued pacing slightly with the microphone in her hand. "Look at that suit, it is practically bursting at the seams, and I'm pretty sure it has not been washed since the 90s. This is the broke, dirty old man we have to put up with now," she said, shrugging her bare shoulders dramatically. "We tried to get him to buy a decent tuxedo, but I guess you cannot teach an old stubborn dog how to sit at a fancy table." The laughter grew louder, echoing off the high, painted ceilings. I did not move a single muscle, but my eyes locked onto my son. Marcus was sitting right next to her, wearing the white tuxedo that I had secretly paid for. I waited for him to stand up. I waited for the boy I raised, the boy I worked double shifts to put through college to take the microphone away from her. I waited for him to defend his father the way a real man should. Marcus did not stand up. He did not look at me with apology or anger toward his new wife. He just looked down at his expensive Italian shoes, his face flushed red, and he chuckled. My own flesh and blood chuckled nervously, laughing right along with the crowd to keep the peace. He chose his wealthy new image over the man who gave him life. He let her call me a dirty old man in front of the entire city because he was too weak to be a man himself. My hand slipped deep into my jacket pocket, gripping the thick envelope. Inside that envelope was a certified cashier check for $500,000. It was meant to be the solid foundation for their family, a massive down payment for a house so they would never have to struggle like I did. I felt the crisp edge of the check under my calloused thumb. With a slow, deliberate motion hidden completely in the shadows of my pocket, I folded the thick paper in half. I pressed my fingers together and I tore it. I tore the $500,000 into pieces, feeling the rigid paper snap, turning a fortune into worthless confetti. I did not shed a tear, and I did not yell. I just stood there, breathing in the scent of expensive perfume and cheap character, registering the absolute ingratitude of the boy I loved. I looked around the room at the faces of the Atlanta elite, twisted in cruel amusement. They thought they were looking at a peasant who had stumbled into a palace. They did not understand that true wealth is not worn on the wrist, it is built in the spine. Marcus finally glanced up, meeting my eyes through the blinding glare of the spotlight. I saw the shame in his expression, but shame is a useless emotion if it does not lead to action. He quickly looked away, lifting his champagne glass to take a sip, washing down his own cowardice. I knew right then that the son I raised was gone. He had traded his soul for a seat at a table where he would never truly be respected. The music started playing again, a fast, upbeat tempo as the guests clapped for Kendra's speech. The spotlight finally moved off my face, leaving me back in the cool, quiet shadows near the heavy oak doors. I let the shredded pieces of the check settle at the bottom of my pocket. The disrespect had crossed the line from a simple misunderstanding to a deliberate public execution of my dignity. The music picked up again, a fast tempo that matched the greedy energy of the room. I stayed against the back wall, letting the shadows hide the cold truth in my eyes. I watched the elite of Atlanta mingle their expensive silk suits and heavy gold watches flashing in the light. They thought they owned the city. I knew I owned the ground they were dancing on. I saw Reginald pushing his way through the crowd, heading straight toward my corner. He was sweating through his custom tuxedo, his face flushed with arrogance and too much expensive liquor. He walked with the heavy, unearned swagger of a man spending someone else's money. He stopped a few feet from me, bringing the sharp smell of premium scotch and cheap cologne. "Well, Isaiah," he said loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. That was quite the introduction. I looked at him, my expression completely blank. I did not speak. I let the silence stretch out, forcing him to fill the empty air with his own foolishness. "Do not take it personally, old man." Reginald chuckled, wiping his sweaty forehead with a silk handkerchief. "Kendra just has a very refined sense of humor. You have to admit you stick out like a sore thumb in a place like this." He reached into his tailored pants, pulling out a thick money clip made of brushed silver. He peeled off a single $20 bill and held it out toward me. Here he said, a cruel smirk twisting his face. "Go buy yourself some stain remover for that jacket, or maybe put some gas in whatever rusted-out truck you drove here. Consider it a tip from the father of the bride." He flicked his wrist, and the $20 bill fluttered through the air, landing right on the toes of my scuffed work shoes. He expected me to bend down. He expected me to pick it up like a grateful beggar. I just looked down at the crumpled green paper and then back up at his red, sweaty face. "Keep your money, Reginald," I said, my voice low and steady. "You might need it more than I do." Reginald threw his head back and laughed, a loud barking sound that drew the attention of the surrounding guests. "Oh, I highly doubt that, Isaiah," he boasted, puffing out his chest. "You are looking at a man who is about to make history." He stepped closer, invading my personal space, desperate to show off his power. "You see this wedding?" he asked, gesturing wildly around the lavish ballroom. "This is just the beginning. I am celebrating tonight. Come Monday morning, the board of directors at Sterling Logistics is officially naming me Chief Executive Officer." I felt a cold prickle at the base of my neck. Sterling Logistics. It was the exact company my acquisition team had been quietly auditing for the past 3 months. It was the company I had officially purchased at 6 o'clock that very morning. "I'm going to be running the biggest supply chain network in the South," Reginald bragged, completely unaware that he was talking to his new boss. "I'm going to restructure the whole operation, strip the dead weight, and walk away with a bonus that could buy your entire neighborhood 10 times over. I am untouchable, Isaiah." He was confessing his entire plan. He was confirming every suspicion my auditors had about the missing pension funds and the fraudulent vendor contracts. He thought he was a predator showing off his teeth to a stray dog. He did not realize he was already bleeding in a shark tank. "Congratulations, Reginald," I said, keeping my face completely neutral. "I am sure Monday will be a day you will never forget." He smiled a wide, predatory grin. "You better believe it, mechanic," he sneered. "Now be a good boy, stay out of the official photos, and enjoy the free meal. It is probably the best food you will eat all decade." He turned on his heel and marched back toward the head table, strutting like a king who had just conquered a peasant. I watched him go, feeling the absolute certainty of what had to be done. He had insulted my livelihood, he had mocked my presence, and he had stolen from his own workers. The time for observation was over. The time for execution had arrived. I looked down at the $20 bill resting on my shoe. I did not bend down to pick it up. I simply stepped over it, leaving his insult on the floor where it belonged. I turned my back on the ballroom, on the laughter, and on the son who had abandoned me. I pushed open the heavy oak doors, stepping out of the glittering trap and into the cool Atlanta night. I walked down the long, carpeted hallway of the Buckhead Country Club. The muffled sound of the heavy bass from the ballroom faded completely behind me. I spotted the event coordinator, a nervous-looking woman holding a clipboard standing near the front entrance. I walked straight up to her, my posture tall and unbending. "Excuse me," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the quiet lobby. She looked up from her notes, her eyes dropping immediately to the dark grease stain on my jacket. "The restrooms are down the stairs to your left, sir," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "I am not looking for the restroom," I replied, my tone flat and commanding. "My name is Isaiah, and I am the one paying the $85,000 bill for this entire event." Her face drained of color in an instant. "Oh, Mr. Isaiah," she stammered, looking absolutely terrified. "I'm so terribly sorry. Is everything to your liking tonight?" I reached into my pocket, pulling out my wallet. It was a simple, worn leather wallet, but from it, I produced a heavy, solid black titanium card, the Centurion card. I placed it directly on her clipboard. "I'm changing the terms of the contract right now," I said, my eyes locking onto hers. "You are going to walk into that ballroom and shut down the open bar immediately. From this exact second forward, every single drink is cash only, and I want the prices set to the absolute hotel maximum." She looked horrified, stepping back slightly. "But sir," she warned, her voice trembling, "the guests will be absolutely furious." I did not blink, and I did not soften my expression. "Do it right now," I instructed, "or I will dispute the entire $85,000 charge tonight, and you will explain the loss to your general manager." She nodded quickly, grabbing her two-way radio with a shaking hand. I stepped out through the heavy glass doors into the warm, humid Atlanta night air. I walked across the massive parking lot past the endless rows of leased luxury cars until I found my 10-year-old heavy-duty work truck. It smelled like diesel and hard, honest work, a smell that I had earned over decades. I unlocked the heavy door, climbed up into the cab, and pulled out my mobile phone. I hit the speed dial for Vance. He was my corporate attorney, a ruthless legal shark who operated out of a massive high-rise in downtown Atlanta. He answered on the very first ring. "Good evening," Isaiah Vance said, his voice crisp and strictly professional. "I assume the grand wedding festivities have concluded. They are just getting started, Vance," I said, staring out through the dusty windshield. "But the free ride is officially over. I need you to initiate a few major protocols tonight." "Tell me what you need," Vance replied, and I could hear him typing rapidly on his keyboard. "First," I said, taking a deep breath, "I want you to completely freeze the checking account ending in 4490. That is the account I use to deposit Marcus' monthly allowance, the money he thinks is a legal settlement. Cut it off completely. Not another dime goes into his pocket. He wants to be a married man. He can learn how to pay his own bills." "Done," Vance said without a shred of hesitation. "What else is on the agenda?" I leaned my head back against the worn leather seat. "Reginald just confirmed everything your audit team suspected," I said, my voice hardening into solid stone. "He thinks he is being crowned Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Logistics on Monday morning. He actually bragged to my face about the pension money he embezzled." "I want you to prepare the absolute slaughter, Vance," I continued. "I want a full forensic accounting of every single dollar he stole from his own workers. I want the termination papers drafted for gross misconduct, and I want you to contact the district attorney tonight. We are not just firing him, we are putting him in a concrete cage." "Understood completely," Isaiah Vance said, his tone turning absolutely lethal. "The board meeting is set for 9:00 Monday morning. Make sure the police detectives are waiting in the corporate lobby by 10, I ordered. They wanted to treat me like a joke tonight. They wanted to disrespect the very hands that feed them and laugh at my expense. On Monday morning, they are going to learn exactly who owns the farm." I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. I turned the key and the heavy diesel engine roared to life, shaking the solid frame of the truck. I pulled out of the country club parking lot, leaving the fake smiles and the rented diamonds far behind me. The war had officially started, and they had absolutely no idea they were fighting a man who owned the entire battlefield. I drove away from the country club, leaving the glittering trap behind me in the rearview mirror. But back inside that extravagant ballroom, the first heavy domino was already falling hard. The music was still pumping a loud, obnoxious bass that rattled the crystal glasses on the tables. The elite of Atlanta were sweating through their silk suits, dancing and celebrating a marriage built entirely on unearned arrogance. The open bar had been the main attraction all night. It was a massive, sweeping mahogany counter stacked high with premium vodka and expensive aged bourbon. The guests were drinking like there was no tomorrow, completely oblivious to the fact that their tomorrow had just been officially canceled. The nervous event coordinator had sprinted across the lobby, clutching her two-way radio like an absolute lifeline. She gave the strict order to the head bartender. "The free ride is over," she said, her voice shaking with anxiety. "Charge the maximum price for every single drop and accept cash or credit only." The bartender, a young college kid in a crisp white shirt, looked terrified, but he did not hesitate to follow instructions. He reached under the long counter and pulled out a stack of small black leather check presenter books. He placed a small, elegant sign right on the polished wood. "Cash, bar, only," it read. It took exactly 4 minutes for the total chaos to erupt. A local city politician, a man with a fake tan and a tailored suit, walked up to the bar and ordered a double gin martini. The bartender mixed the clear drink, placed it on a white napkin, and looked the powerful man dead in the eye. "That will be $45, sir," the bartender said, his voice carrying cleanly over the loud party music. The politician froze instantly, his hand hovering over the cold glass. "Excuse me," he asked, looking around the room in utter confusion. "This is a private open bar. Reginald is paying for everything tonight." The bartender shook his head gently, holding his ground behind the counter. "The host has officially changed the contract, sir," the bartender replied calmly. "All beverages are now cash or card with absolutely no exceptions." The angry whisper spread through the massive ballroom, moving faster than a grease fire in a dry garage. It jumped from table to table, infecting the wealthy guests with absolute entitled outrage. The free liquor was gone. The people who were used to getting everything handed to them on a silver platter were suddenly being asked to open their own expensive wallets. A long, frustrated line began to form at the bar. People were complaining loudly, scoffing in disbelief, and looking around for the man responsible for the sudden public humiliation. Reginald was holding court near the edge of the dance floor, sweating heavily and bragging to anyone who would listen about his upcoming promotion to chief executive officer. He finally noticed the angry commotion at the bar and frowned deeply. He pushed his massive frame through the crowded room, marching up to the mahogany counter with his chest puffed out. "What in the world is going on here?" Reginald shouted, slamming his heavy hand down on the wood. "Why is there a line at my daughter's wedding? Pour these important people their drinks immediately." The young bartender did not flinch or step back. "I am sorry, sir," the bartender said, wiping a clean glass with a white towel. "The host has closed the open tab tonight. It is a strictly cash bar from this moment forward." Reginald turned a deep, furious shade of purple. "I am the host, you idiot!" Reginald roared, pointing a thick, aggressive finger right at the young man's face. "I am the father of the bride, and I demand you serve my guests right now." "Actually, sir," the bartender said, checking a small printed piece of paper near the modern register. "The host is legally listed as Mr. Isaiah, and he specifically ordered the massive tab closed." Reginald let out a harsh, incredibly arrogant laugh. That broke old Southside mechanic Reginald scoffed loudly, waving his hand in disgust. "He does not have a single dime to his name. Fine if he wants to play stupid games, put the entire bar tab on my card right now." Reginald reached into his tailored tuxedo pants and pulled out a heavy platinum credit card. He slammed the shiny plastic down on the bar, looking around at his wealthy friends with a smug, victorious smile. "I will handle this minor inconvenience," Reginald announced to the surrounding crowd. "Drink up, everyone. The drinks are on the next chief executive officer of Sterling Logistics." The crowd cheered slightly, greatly relieved that their own deep pockets were safe. The bartender picked up the platinum card and swiped it smoothly through the modern register terminal. The machine beeped a sharp, flat, denying sound. The bartender looked down at the digital screen and frowned. "I am sorry, sir. The card is unfortunately declined," the bartender said, pushing the platinum card back across the polished counter. Reginald stopped smiling instantly. His face tightened with absolute burning rage. "Run it again right now," Reginald snapped, his voice dropping into a dangerous, threatening hiss. "That specific card has a $50,000 limit. Run it again." The bartender swiped the heavy card a second time. The exact same sharp beep echoed from the small machine. "Declined again, sir." The bartender repeated, his voice staying entirely firm. Reginald started to truly panic, but he tried his hardest to hide it under a thick mask of fury. He reached desperately into his jacket pocket, his hands shaking slightly, and pulled out a solid gold corporate expense card. He threw it aggressively at the bartender. "Use that one immediately," Reginald ordered, trying desperately to maintain his powerful, arrogant posture. "That is a corporate business account. It has absolutely no limit." He did not know that I had already made my phone call to Vance. He did not know that as the new majority shareholder and absolute owner of Sterling Logistics, I had ordered every single executive expense account completely frozen. The bartender swiped the gold corporate card. The machine beeped a third time, flashing a bright red warning light on the digital screen. "Declined, sir," the bartender said, his voice carrying very clearly to the crowd of elite guests waiting in line. "Account permanently frozen by the issuing corporation." The silence that fell over the crowded bar area was absolutely deafening. The wealthy local politicians, the elite, corporate executives, the high society, wives, they all stopped and stared directly at Reginald. They saw a man who claimed to own the entire city, completely unable to pay for a single glass of cheap champagne. The grand illusion of his immense wealth was cracking violently right in front of their judgmental eyes. Kendra saw the terrible commotion from the dance floor and came storming over angrily, holding up the hem of her heavy designer dress. "What is the problem, Daddy?" Kendra asked, her voice shrill and incredibly demanding. "Fix this right now. These people are laughing at us." Reginald looked down at his spoiled daughter, his face totally slick with cold, nervous sweat. "I cannot fix it," Reginald whispered, his voice trembling with sheer undeniable panic. "The cards are not working. Kendra, none of my cards are working at all." Kendra gasped loudly, her hands flying up to her mouth in absolute unshielded horror. She looked around at her elite judging friends, seeing the deep pity and the pure disgust in their eyes. The flawless, expensive wedding she had built on a mountain of arrogant lies was collapsing into useless dust. And I was miles away driving my old diesel truck through the dark city, knowing exactly what kind of bitter harvest they were reaping. The Sunday morning sun rose hot and bright over the wealthy suburbs of Atlanta. I sat in the cab of my old diesel truck, parked quietly 3 houses down from a stunning luxury townhouse. I held a thermos of black coffee, watching the steam curl against the windshield. I had not slept a single minute, but my mind was sharper than a razor. The street was lined with perfectly manicured lawns and expensive imported cars. It was the exact kind of neighborhood where people thought bad things only happened on the evening news. But a bad thing was coming, and it was driving a massive, moving truck. At exactly 9:00 in the morning, a heavy white box truck turned the corner, its air brakes hissing loudly in the quiet street. Right behind it, a dark SUV pulled up to the curb. It was an Atlanta County Sheriff vehicle marking the official end of a long, expensive lie. Two large deputies stepped out of the SUV, adjusting their heavy utility belts. They did not look like men who were there to negotiate a polite settlement. They walked up the brick pathway of the townhouse with the absolute purpose of men who had a serious job to do. Behind them, a crew of 6 massive movers jumped out of the box truck, pulling on thick leather work gloves. I cracked the window of my truck, letting the warm morning air in so I could hear the music play. The lead deputy raised his heavy fist and pounded aggressively on the grand oak front door. The loud, demanding knocking echoed down the beautiful street, shattering the peaceful Sunday morning illusion. It took several long minutes for the heavy door to finally open. I imagined Marcus and Kendra inside, exhausted and hungover from the absolute disaster of their expensive wedding night. They probably thought it was a simple delivery driver bringing them more unearned gifts. The heavy door swung open slowly. Marcus stood there in the doorframe wearing a pair of silk pajamas that cost more than my first car. His hair was messy and he was rubbing his tired eyes against the bright morning sun. He looked annoyed, expecting to bark orders at a humble servant. Instead, he was staring at the shiny gold badge of an Atlanta County Sheriff. "What is the problem?" Officer Marcus asked, his voice filled with sleepy, ignorant entitlement. The deputy did not smile and he did not offer a gentle greeting. He reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. "I am serving you with an emergency immediate eviction notice," the deputy said, pushing the heavy papers directly into my son's chest. "The property owner has exercised the absolute right of immediate termination due to gross breach of contract. You have exactly 1 hour to vacate the premises completely." Marcus looked at the papers and then he let out a short, arrogant laugh. He actually thought it was a terrible, misplaced prank. He shook his head, trying to hand the thick papers back. "There is a massive mistake here, officer," Marcus stated, puffing out his chest to look important. "We pay our rent on time every single month with a trust fund check. You have the completely wrong house." The deputy stepped forward, putting his heavy work boot directly over the threshold of the expensive home. "There is absolutely no mistake, sir," the deputy replied, his voice dropping into a hard, professional tone. "The documents are signed and authorized by a county judge at 8 o'clock this morning. If you do not step aside and let the moving crew begin, you will be arrested for criminal trespassing." Marcus froze completely, his unearned arrogance melting away into absolute terrified shock. Kendra appeared in the hallway right behind him, wrapping a fluffy white designer robe tightly around her waist. "What is going on out here, Marcus?" she demanded, using her shrill, commanding tone. "Tell these loud men to go away. I am trying to sleep." The deputy completely ignored her loud complaints. He waved his hand toward the street, and the crew of massive movers marched right up the brick pathway. They pushed right past my stunned son and entered the beautiful luxury townhouse. The absolute destruction of their fake empire officially began right in front of their eyes. The movers did not care about the delicate crystal or the expensive modern art on the walls. They were paid to empty the house fast. 2 men carried out a massive white leather sofa and dumped it without a shred of care directly onto the damp front lawn. Another man carried out an armful of expensive wedding gifts, dropping the shiny silver boxes right into the green grass. Kendra started screaming at the top of her lungs. She ran out onto the front porch, waving her hands wildly in the air. "You cannot do this to us!" Kendra shrieked, tears of pure rage streaming down her face. "Do you know who my father is? He will have all of your badges by tomorrow morning." The deputy stood perfectly still on the front steps, entirely unbothered by her loud threats. "Your father does not own this property, ma'am," the deputy stated firmly. "And he has absolutely no legal authority here. I strongly suggest you go inside and gather your most important personal belongings before they end up on the sidewalk." Marcus stumbled backward out onto the manicured lawn, clutching the thick eviction papers in his shaking hands. He flipped through the legal documents, his eyes darting across the heavy black ink. I watched from the cab of my truck, taking a slow sip of my coffee, waiting for the exact moment the devastating truth finally hit him. He reached the absolute last page of the legal packet. He stopped breathing entirely. He stared directly at the signature line at the bottom. He had lived in that magnificent house for 2 entire years. He had mailed his heavily subsidized rent check every single month to a corporate holding company called IM Logistics Property Management. He had never once bothered to look up the owner. He simply assumed the world owed him a cheap, luxurious life handed to him on a silver platter. Now standing barefoot on the cold morning grass, he read the full name of the true property owner printed clearly below the bold signature. Isaiah, the old, dirty South Side mechanic, the man he had let his wife call a broke pig. Marcus let out a ragged, choking gasp. The expensive legal papers fell from his trembling hands, scattering across the wet lawn. He looked up, his eyes wide and completely hollow. He scanned the quiet, expensive street looking for an answer, looking for a way out of the trap he had built with his own arrogance. He slowly turned his head, looking down the long block past the beautiful manicured trees. His eyes locked directly onto my old rusted diesel truck parked silently in the shadows. He saw me sitting behind the steering wheel, my face perfectly calm, watching him lose absolutely everything. Marcus stood frozen on the damp grass, staring directly at my heavy diesel truck. The loud, brutal reality of his situation was crashing down on him all at once. Behind him, the moving crew was completely merciless. They carried out armfuls of expensive designer clothes still hanging on velvet hangers and tossed them carelessly into heavy black contractor bags. They dragged the massive flat-screen television out the front door, leaving it leaning against a small decorative bush. The beautiful, pristine life they had bragged about just 12 hours ago was now a pile of embarrassing garbage on the sidewalk. A loud, aggressive backup beeper cut sharply through the quiet neighborhood air. Beep, beep, beep. A heavy-duty flatbed tow truck covered in rust and thick chains backed slowly into the expensive paved driveway. The driver jumped out of the cab wearing heavy work boots and a stained shirt. He walked straight toward the gleaming white luxury SUV that Kendra treated like a royal carriage. Kendra stopped screaming at the busy moving crew and turned her pure, unshielded horror toward the driveway. "What do you think you were doing?" she shrieked, hiking up her expensive white robe and running frantically across the lawn. "That is my personal vehicle. My father pays the lease on that car. You get away from it right now." The tow truck driver did not even look at her. He pulled a thick steel cable from the back of his flatbed and hooked the heavy chains right onto the front axle of the pristine SUV. "I have a court-ordered repossession, ma'am," the driver said, his voice completely bored and tired. The corporate account holding this specific lease was completely liquidated and frozen at exactly 6 o'clock this morning. Kendra threw her body against the driver's side door, sobbing loudly, her expensive designer robe dragging completely in the dirt. "You cannot take my car," she cried out, her voice cracking with pure ugly desperation. "We need this vehicle. You are absolutely ruining my life. Someone call the police." The sheriff deputy walked over immediately and gently but firmly pulled her away from the expensive metal. She collapsed right onto the edge of the paved driveway, weeping into her manicured hands as the heavy mechanical winch clicked loudly. It pulled her pristine status symbol, dragging it up onto the rusty flatbed, tilting her perfect world entirely upside down. The tow truck driver secured the tires, climbed back into his cab, and drove away without a single backward glance, taking her arrogant freedom right down the street. Marcus did not go to comfort his weeping wife. He did not yell at the tow truck driver or argue with the armed deputies. He simply started walking. He walked slowly barefoot on the cold, rough asphalt, walking straight down the block toward my idling truck. He looked incredibly small, stripped entirely of his unearned pride and his fake wealth. He reached the driver's side of my heavy diesel truck and put his trembling hand flat against the dusty metal door. I pressed the button and the window rolled down slowly. The bitter smell of my black coffee drifted out into the cool morning air, meeting the absolute stench of his spectacular failure. Dad Marcus whispered, his voice shaking so badly he could barely form the simple word. You own the house, you are the holding company on the lease. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my hot coffee. I am, I replied, keeping my voice entirely flat and devoid of any sympathy. I bought it 3 years ago to give you a solid roof over your head while you figured out how to be a real man. But why are you doing this? Marcus pleaded, tears welling up in his red, exhausted eyes. All of our stuff is sitting out on the front lawn. They just towed Kendra's car away, and the neighbors are taking pictures. We have absolutely nowhere to go. Dad, you have to stop these men right now. I looked past him, watching the wealthy neighbors stepping out onto their grand porches, holding their smartphones up to record the magnificent downfall. I am not stopping anything. Marcus, I said calmly, resting my arm on the open window frame. I am just correcting a massive mistake I made. I cushioned your life so much that you completely forgot how the real world actually works. Marcus gripped the window frame tightly, his knuckles turning totally white. Please, Dad. He begged, his voice breaking into a pathetic whine. We are so sorry about the wedding. We are sorry about the terrible jokes she made. Just tell them to put our stuff back inside, and I swear to you I will pay you back every single dime. I let out a short, dry, humorless laugh. Pay me back? I asked, my voice hardening into absolute steel. With what money, Marcus, are you going to use your monthly allowance, the one you think came from that fake car accident settlement? Marcus froze completely, his eyes widening in pure, devastating shock. He swayed on his bare feet like he had just been punched directly in the stomach. You pay my allowance, he stammered, his mind struggling desperately to process the crushing reality. There was never an insurance settlement, I said, leaning closer to the open window, making sure he heard every single word. You never had a financial payout. I invented that entire lie so you would not feel like a charity case in front of your wealthy friends. I have been paying your bills, subsidizing your extravagant lifestyle, and keeping you afloat for 3 entire years. And exactly how did you repay my sacrifice? I continued, letting the cold, heavy anger rise in my chest. You stood by and chuckled while your spoiled wife called me a dirty old pig on a public microphone. You sat me by the kitchen doors because my hard work embarrassed you. Marcus looked down at the rough street, a tear finally rolling down his cheek. I am sorry, he whispered, looking exactly like a broken, helpless little boy. Sorry does not pay the mortgage, I said, reaching down for the heavy gear shift. And neither do I, not anymore. The bank transfer scheduled for tomorrow morning is permanently canceled. You are officially cut off from my money and my protection. I put the heavy truck into gear, the large diesel engine roaring with pure mechanical power. Dad, wait! Marcus cried out, stepping back quickly from the massive, moving tire. Where are we supposed to sleep tonight? What are we supposed to do without any money? I looked at him one last time through the dusty side mirror. You are a smart college graduate, I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the loud engine noise. You wanted to play the role of a big, successful man. Now is your chance to figure it out yourself. I navigated my heavy truck through the quiet morning traffic, feeling a deep, complex ache in my chest. It is never easy to watch your own child fall, but sometimes a broken bone has to be set properly before it can truly heal. I had spent decades under the hoods of massive freight trucks, breathing in hot diesel fumes and breaking my back just to make sure Marcus never had to know the feeling of an empty stomach. I wanted to give him a massive head start in life, but I realized as the miles rolled by that a head start means absolutely nothing if you do not know how to run the actual race. I had given him a kingdom, but I had raised a spoiled prince instead of a strong king. Today was the first day of his real education. In my rearview mirror, the image of my son, standing on that wet grass, slowly faded away into the distance. But I did not have to be standing next to him to know exactly what his next move was. He was standing on that curb, surrounded by a mountain of expensive trash, and he was searching for a savior. Kendra was sitting on a crushed cardboard box, weeping loudly into her manicured hands, her white designer robe stained with dirt and morning dew. The moving crew had slammed the heavy doors of their box truck and driven off down the street, leaving them entirely alone. The wealthy neighbors were still standing on their pristine porches, holding their smartphones up, recording every single second of the spectacular downfall. Marcus slowly reached into his silk pajama pocket and pulled out his cell phone. He was going to call Reginald. He thought his rich father-in-law was going to ride in on a white horse and fix everything with a single massive check. But Reginald was not answering his phone today. Reginald was hiding. Across the city in a massive, strictly gated community, Reginald was locked securely inside his own leased mansion. I knew this for an absolute fact because I had my corporate security team parked discreetly at the end of his long private driveway. Reginald was sitting in his dark, expensive home office, sweating through his silk clothes, staring at a computer screen that was actively destroying his entire life. Just 2 hours earlier, my attorney Vance had leaked a massive, undeniable rumor to the biggest financial blogs in Atlanta. The headline was simple, but absolutely lethal. Sterling Logistics under federal investigation for massive internal embezzlement and a hostile takeover is entirely imminent. Reginald was watching the corporate stock prices violently shaking and dropping on his bright monitor. He was watching his fake empire burn completely to the ground. His cell phone was ringing endlessly on his grand mahogany desk, buzzing with desperate, frantic calls from his spoiled daughter. Kendra was dialing his number over and over again, standing on that cold curb, screaming violently into the voicemail. "Pick up the phone, Daddy," she sobbed, stomping her bare feet on the rough concrete. "They took my beautiful car away, and we are sitting outside on the street like animals. Please come get us right now." Reginald did not pick up the phone. He could not face his own daughter because he was too busy shredding his own fraudulent illegal documents. He was frantically feeding vendor contracts and fake expense reports into a heavy-duty paper shredder, desperately trying to erase 5 years of arrogant theft. He thought he was preparing to become the chief executive officer on Monday morning. Now he was just a terrified, cornered rat trying to escape a sinking ship that he had personally drilled massive holes in. He looked out his large office window, staring at the 3 luxury cars parked in his driveway, knowing deep down that the repo men would be coming for those next. Back on the curb, Marcus watched his wife throw her expensive phone directly onto the grass in a fit of absolute rage. "He is not answering me," Kendra screamed, her voice echoing painfully down the quiet, judgmental street. "Why is he not answering his phone? He promised to buy us a massive house if this ever happened." Marcus just stood there looking at the expensive leather sofa, sitting sideways in the wet dirt. He looked at the crystal wine glasses, tumbling out of a hastily packed box, shattering into 100 pieces on the hard sidewalk. He finally realized that the magic money tree had been entirely chopped down to the roots. They had absolutely no cash because their accounts were frozen solid. They had no credit cards because I had canceled the secondary limits. They had no shelter because I held the actual deed to their fake life. They were completely stripped of their fake status, left with nothing but the expensive silk on their backs and the bitter, unavoidable consequences of their own massive disrespect. They were forced to sit on that embarrassing curb for 3 agonizing hours while the hot Atlanta sun beat down on their shoulders. They tried to call their wealthy friends the exact same friends who had laughed at me the night before. But nobody in that elite circle wanted anything to do with a sudden, embarrassing tragedy. The socialites of Atlanta do not answer the phone for broke homeless people. Eventually, Marcus had to swallow every single ounce of his unearned pride. He walked over a mile to a nearby gas station, his bare feet blistering terribly on the hot summer pavement. He used the last $20 bill in his pocket to call a cheap local moving van. He had to load the heavy boxes himself, sweating and straining his soft muscles, while Kendra sat in the grass and cried like a helpless child. They packed what little they could salvage, leaving the massive luxury furniture sitting on the lawn, abandoned like absolute garbage. They drove away in a rented, dirty van, heading toward the only place they had left to go. They were heading to Reginald, completely unaware that they were running straight from a minor storm directly into an absolute devastating hurricane. I parked my heavy diesel truck in the underground garage of the tallest skyscraper in downtown Atlanta. The valet attendant in the VIP section tried to wave me away with a frantic motion pointing toward the public parking lot. I simply rolled down my window and handed him the solid brass corporate key card. He saw the engraved logistics logo, his eyes widened in sudden fear, and he stepped back with his head bowed down. I rode the private glass-walled elevator all the way up to the 60th floor. The silver doors slid open silently, revealing the massive, sprawling legal offices of Vance and Associates. The main reception area was covered entirely in imported Italian marble and expensive modern art pieces. The legal staff wore custom-tailored suits, moving quietly across the incredibly thick plush carpets. They all stopped and stared openly as I walked straight through the double-glass doors. I was still wearing my old work jeans, a faded flannel shirt, and my heavy scuffed work boots. They did not know my face, and they clearly judged my rough appearance, but they quickly recognized the heavy, confident way I walked. Vance was waiting for me standing inside his massive corner office. The walls were made entirely of thick glass overlooking the beautiful, sprawling Atlanta skyline. "Good morning," Isaiah Vance said, gesturing respectfully toward a heavy black leather chair. I took a seat, crossing my arms over my chest, feeling the solid weight of the incoming war. "Give me the final damage report, Vance," I instructed, my voice cutting cleanly through the quiet, air-conditioned room. Vance did not waste a single second with polite small talk. He opened a thick, heavy black leather folder and pushed a massive stack of financial documents right across the polished mahogany wood. "The situation is far worse than our initial corporate audit suggested," Vance explained, tapping his expensive silver pen on the top page. Reginald did not just inflate his executive expense accounts or steal petty cash. He systematically drained the primary employee pension fund over the last 5 entire years. I leaned forward in the leather chair, looking closely at the long columns of glaring red numbers. "He stole from the retired factory workers?" I asked, feeling a cold, incredibly hard knot of pure anger form deep in my stomach. "Yes," Isaiah Vance replied, his tone remaining absolutely clinical and sharp. "He created 3 separate illegal shell companies registered under completely fake names and offshore banking accounts. He slowly funneled exactly $4 million right out of the honest workers' retirement savings." I took a slow, deep breath, trying to control the absolute fury rising in my chest. I spent 40 years of my life building my entire business from a single broken-down tow truck. I know exactly what it feels like to work a grueling double shift with a terrible aching back just to put simple food on the family table. Those dedicated factory workers gave Sterling Logistics their youth, their health, and their absolute blind loyalty. They completely trusted the corporate board to protect their future. And Reginald treated their hard-earned life savings like his own personal casino chips. It was a level of pure, unadulterated evil that demanded absolute, merciless destruction. But where did the stolen money actually go? I asked, knowing Reginald was far too foolish to hide it properly. He was leasing his massive mansion and his fancy imported cars. He clearly did not have $4 million sitting in a local bank account. Vance pulled out another thick file, this one heavily marked with a bright red confidential seal. "That is the truly pathetic part of this entire tragedy," Isaiah Vance said, leaning back slowly in his heavy leather chair. "Reginald is a degenerate, desperate gambler and a surprisingly terrible businessman. He tried to play the high-risk stock market with the stolen company money, and he lost absolutely everything in a series of incredibly stupid trades. To cover his massive market losses, Vance continued sliding a photograph across the desk. Reginald took out high-interest illegal loans from completely unregulated private lenders. He borrowed millions from very dangerous people operating out of underground casinos right here in the city. Loan sharks, I said, shaking my head in absolute bitter disgust. A man who wears a $5,000 custom tuxedo is deeply in debt to violent street thugs. Exactly, Vance confirmed, pointing a firm finger at the clear photograph. And those dangerous street thugs are actively demanding their money back immediately. We intercepted a series of highly threatening text messages. They have been directly threatening his life and the physical safety of his family. That is exactly why he is so incredibly desperate to become the chief executive officer tomorrow morning. He absolutely needs immediate access to the main corporate treasury to pay off his dangerous, violent street debts before they come to collect his kneecaps. I stood up from the leather chair and walked over to the massive glass window. I looked down at the tiny moving cars on the busy highway far below. Reginald was nothing but a fragile parasite. He was a weak, pathetic coward who selfishly gambled with the innocent lives of hardworking men and women just to maintain a fake, arrogant image of absolute power. He thought he was the smartest man in the entire city, untouchable and supreme. He thought he could outrun his terrible sins. Prepare the final, undeniable termination papers, Vance, we ordered, keeping my cold eyes fixed on the sprawling city below. I want every single piece of financial evidence packaged perfectly and securely for the district attorney. When I walk into that corporate boardroom tomorrow morning, I'm not just firing a bad executive. I am locking a highly dangerous criminal in a concrete cage. Vance smiled a cold, predatory grin, closing the heavy black folder with a sharp, satisfying snap. Everything is completely ready, Isaiah. Vance assured me, his voice echoing with absolute legal certainty. The corporate trap is perfectly set and the bait has been swallowed whole. I knew exactly what was happening inside that massive leased mansion because my private security team was parked right outside his tall iron gates. Reginald was pacing a deep, frantic trench into his expensive imported rugs. His mobile phone vibrated violently on the heavy glass coffee table. It was not a call from his corporate board, and it was not a call from his spoiled daughter. It was a text message from a cheap burner phone sent by the dangerous, violent men who held his massive gambling debts. The message was incredibly simple and absolutely terrifying. Pay us by Monday at noon, or we will permanently break your legs. Reginald stared directly at the glowing screen, wiping the cold, terrified sweat from his dark forehead. He was a man who lived his entire life on fake borrowed time, and the clock had finally run out completely. His personal bank accounts were entirely empty, drained by his own foolish greed and the swift legal block my attorney had placed on his corporate cards. He walked over to his wet bar and poured himself a glass of warm tap water because he could not even afford to buy his favorite premium scotch. Just as the absolute terror settled deep into his bones, a loud, obnoxious horn honked at his front gate. It was not a sleek luxury town car. It was a dirty, rented moving van covered in thick city grime and smelling like heavy exhaust. Marcus and Kendra had finally arrived, completely stripped of their fake, arrogant pride. The heavy iron gates swung open slowly, and the battered van sputtered up the long, pristine driveway, leaking dark drops of dirty oil onto the expensive paving stones. Reginald opened his massive front door, forcing a completely fake, highly confident smile onto his face. He had to play the role of the wealthy, powerful savior, even though his own massive house of cards was collapsing right on top of his head. Kendra stumbled out of the passenger side, her white designer robe ruined with dark street dirt and thick tears streaking her expensive makeup. "Oh, Daddy," she cried out loudly, running up the wide stone steps and throwing her arms heavily around his stiff neck. "It is an absolute nightmare. That horrible old mechanic threw us out onto the street and they towed my beautiful luxury car away." Marcus climbed slowly out of the driver's seat, looking completely defeated and entirely exhausted. He carried 2 hastily packed cardboard boxes, his bare feet covered in painful red blisters and dark street dirt. Reginald looked closely at my son, feeling a sudden intense flash of absolute annoyance and pure disgust. He did not want these 2 useless, spoiled adults living in his house, but he had to maintain the grand illusion of his immense, untouchable wealth. "Bring your things inside quickly," Reginald ordered firmly, looking nervously down the quiet, manicured street, terrified that his violent creditors were watching from the deep shadows. They carried their pathetic heavy boxes into the grand foyer, dropping them loudly onto the polished marble floor. The massive house was completely silent and felt incredibly cold. Kendra collapsed onto a large white velvet sofa, complaining loudly about her terrible, completely ruined day. "I am so incredibly hungry, Daddy," she whined, rubbing her temples dramatically. "We have not eaten a single thing all day long. Please order us some food from that incredibly expensive Italian place downtown." Reginald froze completely in his tracks, his fake smile dropping into a look of pure, unadulterated panic. He reached instinctively into his tailored pocket, touching the expensive leather wallet that was currently filled with completely useless, entirely declined plastic cards. He could not order from the expensive Italian place. He could not even order a cheap, greasy local pizza. His checking accounts were entirely overdrawn. His credit limits were absolutely maxed out, and his corporate funds were frozen solid by my ruthless legal team. "I will just see what we have in the kitchen right now." Reginald stammered, his voice cracking slightly with pure, undeniable shame. "My private chef took the weekend off, so we might have to make do with something simple tonight." Kendra scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes in absolute spoiled disgust. "Make do," she complained bitterly. "We just lost our entire beautiful house, Daddy. The absolute least you can do is buy us a decent hot meal to make us feel slightly better." Reginald walked quickly away from them, stepping into his massive, state-of-the-art gourmet kitchen. He pulled open the heavy door of the incredibly expensive stainless steel refrigerator. It was completely empty except for a half-empty bottle of filtered water and a small glass jar of imported mustard. He stood there silently in the cold light of the empty fridge, feeling the absolute crushing weight of his spectacular failure. He was the arrogant father of the bride, the man who constantly bragged about his massive wealth to anyone who would listen. Now he was hiding like a coward in his own dark kitchen, completely unable to feed his own spoiled daughter or his incredibly useless new son-in-law. The heavy pressure inside that massive leased mansion was building rapidly into a highly explosive, incredibly dangerous situation. Reginald was backed completely into a dark corner, entirely surrounded by angry loan sharks, a frozen corporate treasury, and 2 demanding, hungry adults who fully expected him to fix absolutely everything instantly. He closed the heavy refrigerator door, leaning his sweaty forehead against the cool stainless steel metal. He needed massive amounts of cash, and he needed it immediately before the violent street thugs came to collect their terrible due. And in his desperate, highly feverish mind, he suddenly thought of the exact one man he falsely believed was simple and weak enough to actively exploit. He thought of the dirty mechanic from the South Side, completely unaware that the quiet old mechanic was the exact man tightening the heavy noose around his neck. I sat in the quiet darkness of my own home office on the south side of Atlanta. The heavy oak desk belonged to my late wife, and it still smelled faintly of her lemon polish. I was currently reviewing the digital foreclosure documents for the exact leased mansion Reginald was hiding in. My mobile phone buzzed sharply against the polished wood, breaking the deep, satisfying silence. I looked down at the bright screen, seeing an unknown affluent area code. I knew exactly who was calling, and I let it ring 3 full times, letting him sweat in the dark before I finally swiped to answer. I did not say a single word. I just listened to the heavy, jagged breathing on the other end of the line. "Isaiah, is that you?" Reginald asked, his voice completely stripped of its usual smooth, arrogant polish. He sounded raw and incredibly desperate, like a man trying desperately to hold back an absolute avalanche with his bare hands. In the background, I could hear the muffled, high-pitched sound of Kendra complaining loudly about being hungry. "I am here, Reginald," I said smoothly, my voice as calm as a deep, still lake. "I assume you are calling to thank me for returning the $20 bill you dropped on the floor. Do not play your stupid, pathetic games with me, you old fool," Reginald shouted, completely losing his temper. "You evicted them. You threw my pregnant daughter and your own son out onto the street like garbage. Do you have any idea what kind of absolute chaos you have caused today? They are sitting in my living room right now." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water. "I did not throw them out, Reginald," I explained patiently, leaning back in my heavy chair. "I simply terminated a terrible business arrangement that was no longer profitable for me. You are the wealthy patriarch of the family now, the man they completely look up to. I figured you would absolutely want them under your massive, expensive roof so you can provide for them properly." There was a long, incredibly heavy silence on the line. I could almost hear the rusted gears grinding painfully in his head. He was completely trapped, unable to say no without admitting he was entirely broke, and unable to say yes because he could not even afford to buy them a cheap dinner. "Listen to me very carefully, Isaiah," Reginald finally said, dropping his voice into a low, conspiratorial whisper. "We need to handle this unfortunate situation like real men, like fathers. This silly feud is getting completely out of hand, and it is terrible for the family image." "What exactly do you propose, Reginald?" I asked, letting a tiny hint of fake curiosity slip into my voice. "I'm willing to overlook your highly embarrassing behavior at the wedding," Reginald offered, quickly speaking far too fast. "I'm even willing to let Marcus and Kendra stay here for a few days while they sort their pathetic lives out. But I have a very temporary, highly complex cash flow situation." Ah, there it was. The absolute desperate hook. "What kind of situation?" I asked calmly. "It is complex corporate finance," Reginald said, dismissively, trying to sound important. "You would not understand the high-level details. But with my massive promotion to Chief Executive Officer happening tomorrow morning, my vast assets are currently tied up in a strict blind trust. It is standard executive procedure. Everything is totally frozen for 48 hours. It was a pure, unadulterated lie. His assets were not in a blind trust. They were entirely non-existent." "So you are telling me you are completely broke, Reginald?" I asked, pushing the exact button I knew would enrage him. "I am not broke, you ignorant mechanic," Reginald snapped viciously. "I am temporarily illiquid. There is a massive difference. Look, I need a simple bridge loan, a personal guarantee just to smooth things over until the board finalizes my enormous compensation package on Tuesday." "How much money do you need?" I asked quietly. $200,000, Reginald said, the massive number tumbling out of his mouth way too fast. $200,000, I repeated slowly, letting the heavy amount hang in the quiet air. "That is an awful lot of money for a simple mechanic, Reginald. Why in the world would I ever give you $200,000? Because if you do not sign the guarantor paperwork," Reginald hissed, his voice turning incredibly cold and nasty, "I will completely destroy you and everything you have ever built." I waited for a moment, letting the empty threat echo in my quiet office. "How exactly will you destroy me, Reginald?" I asked. "I have very powerful friends in this city, Isaiah," Reginald bragged, sensing a fake weakness. "I know the local zoning commissioner, I know the city health inspectors, and I know the environmental regulators. I can make one single phone call and have your dirty little South Side garage permanently shut down for massive code violations. I can have them dig up your entire concrete floor, looking for oil leaks, and tie you up in terrible, expensive litigation for years. You will lose your shop, your house, and that ugly truck you love so much. I will bury you in paperwork and massive fines until you are begging for spare change on a street corner." He was bluffing with an empty hand, but he fully believed he held the absolute winning cards. He did not know my legal team literally wrote the zoning laws he was threatening me with. He did not know my massive logistics facilities were inspected by federal agencies that made his local corrupt friends look like simple mall cops. But I needed him to believe he had the upper hand so he would walk blindly into the corporate slaughterhouse. "Please, Reginald," I said, injecting a very realistic tremor of pure fear into my voice. "Do not do that to me. That small shop is absolutely all I have left in the world. It is my only retirement plan." "Then sign the damn paper tomorrow," Reginald demanded, smelling the fake blood in the water. "It is a simple agreement. You co-sign a private loan for me, and I pay it back in a week with heavy interest. You save your pathetic shop. You save your relationship with your son, and everyone wins." I paused for a long time, letting the quiet silence stretch out, making him believe I was weighing my entire survival against my foolish pride. "I do not have that kind of cash liquid, Reginald," I lied, making my voice sound small and incredibly defeated. "I just fix cars for a living. I do not have $200,000 sitting in a personal bank account." "You have hard assets, old man," Reginald countered quickly, his tone dripping with absolute impatience and greedy anticipation. "You own your small house, and you own the dirt that dirty little shop sits on. You put them up as collateral immediately. I have a private lender ready to go, a very discreet investor who completely understands high-level corporate finance. He just needs a solid co-signer with unencumbered property to secure the quick bridge loan. A private lender. That meant a violent loan shark operating out of a dark, smoke-filled basement somewhere in the city. Reginald was actively trying to get me to leverage my own safe home to pay off his dangerous street thugs so he would not get his legs permanently broken. It was incredibly despicable. It was completely pathetic. It was absolutely perfect for my plan. "Okay, Reginald," I whispered, letting out a long, shaky breath of fake defeat. "Okay, you win. I will sign whatever you need me to sign. Just please leave my little shop alone. It is the only thing I have left in this world." "Good choice," Isaiah Reginald said, his voice instantly swelling with a thick, sickening triumph. "That is a very smart choice for a simple mechanic. Now I need you to meet me tomorrow morning bright and early." "Where do you want to meet?" I asked quietly. "At my executive office," Reginald declared proudly. "Sterling Logistics corporate headquarters, downtown, the main boardroom on the 45th floor. You get there at 9 in the morning sharp. I want you to see exactly where real high-level business is done. I want you to see the magnificent view from the very top before you crawl back to your greasy little hole on the south side." He wanted to humiliate me one last terrible time. He wanted me to walk into his massive corporate domain, surrounded by cold glass and expensive steel, and bend my knee to his fake power. He desperately wanted to show off his absolute dominance in front of his wealthy colleagues right before he stole my hard-earned money. He was digging his own massive grave with a heavy backhoe, and he was smiling while he did it. "I will be there, Reginald," I said softly. 9 sharp. Do I need to bring any special paperwork with me?" "Just bring your state identification and a working pen," Reginald commanded sharply. "And Isaiah, please do me a massive favor and wear a different suit. You are going to be in a highly professional corporate environment. Try your absolute hardest not to look like you just finished changing the thick oil in a garbage truck." He let out a short, cruel laugh, and then he ended the call abruptly. The line went completely dead, leaving a hollow dial tone echoing in my quiet office. I pulled the phone slowly away from my ear. The bright digital screen faded to black, and I could see my own dark reflection in the smooth glass. I was not smiling and I was not crying. I was ice cold. Reginald had just crossed the absolute final line. He had actively threatened my livelihood and tried to extort an innocent man using the corrupt power of local government official. He was planning to drag me down into his terrible, violent web of deep street debt and massive deceit just to save his own pathetic skin. I stood up from my heavy oak desk and walked slowly over to the large window. The Atlanta night was fully dark now, and the warm wind was picking up outside, rustling the thick green leaves of the old oak tree in my front yard. I thought about my son, Marcus. He was sitting inside that leased mansion with Reginald right now, completely oblivious to the terrible danger surrounding them. Marcus was probably listening to Reginald brag loudly about how he had easily brought his stubborn old father to heel. Marcus was probably incredibly relieved, thinking his rich father-in-law had successfully fixed everything with a single phone call. He probably thought the magic money train was completely back on track. They were all so incredibly blind, completely blinded by their own unearned arrogance. I walked back to my desk and opened my secure laptop. I typed a fast, encrypted message directly to my corporate attorney, Vance. The trap is officially set. Vance. I wrote, my fingers moving quickly over the keys. The big meeting is confirmed for 9 tomorrow morning in the main Sterling Logistics boardroom. Reginald firmly believes I'm coming to co-sign a high-risk personal loan to cover his massive gambling debts. He actively threatened to use corrupt regulatory leverage to permanently shut down my small business if I refused. Add criminal extortion to the long list of heavy charges we are filing. I paused for a brief second, organizing the exact sequence of the Monday morning slaughter. And Vance, I typed, make absolutely sure the real board of directors is present in that room. Tell them it is an emergency mandatory session regarding the corporate acquisition. But do not tell them I am the actual buyer. Just tell them the new billionaire owner will be revealing himself and handling the massive personnel issues personally. Also have your private security team ready in the main lobby alongside the police detectives. I do not want Reginald making a violent, embarrassing scene when he is dragged out of my building in heavy steel handcuffs. I hit the send button, watching the secure message fly across the digital network. I sat there for a long moment, listening to my quiet, empty house settle around me. The absolute silence was a heavy reminder of exactly what I had lost and exactly what I had to protect. I sat in the quiet, heavy darkness of my home office, listening to the old house settle around me. The legal trap was completely set for Monday morning, but the bitter poison of the weekend was not finished bleeding out. My mobile phone vibrated violently against the polished oak desk, lighting up the dark room with a harsh, bright glare. It was a long text message sent directly from Kendra. She could not wait until the morning to twist the knife. She needed to hurt me tonight to feel a sick sense of absolute power while sitting completely broke in her father's leased mansion. I picked up the smooth glass screen and read the incredibly cruel words. "We are having a baby, Isaiah," the message read. "I am highly pregnant, and because you ruined my perfect expensive wedding and threw us out on the cold street like wild animals, you will absolutely never see this child. My baby will grow up knowing Reginald as a true wealthy grandfather, and you will be nothing but a dirty, forgotten ghost to us. Unless you bring the deed to our house tomorrow morning and formally apologize to my father, you are permanently dead to this entire family." The harsh words hit me directly in the chest like a heavy steel wrench. A grandchild. A small innocent piece of my own bloodline growing right now in the middle of this terrible, greedy war. She was actively weaponizing an unborn child, using a precious, innocent life as a cheap bargaining chip just to extort a free house. I felt a sharp, sudden pain of profound loss, picturing a little boy or girl I might never get to hold. But that deep pain quickly hardened into solid, unbreakable ice. You absolutely do not negotiate with emotional terrorists. If I surrendered my pride and handed over my hard-earned assets, I would be paying a massive ransom for the rest of my natural life. I would be funding the exact same spoiled parasitic behavior that ruined my own son. I stared at the glowing screen for a long time. I typed a very simple, direct reply. "We will see exactly who the ghost is tomorrow," I wrote, and I hit send. I turned the phone completely off and dropped it into my deep pocket. I left the dark office and walked slowly down the short hallway to my master bedroom. I opened the heavy wooden door of my closet and reached deep into the back. I pushed aside the faded flannel work shirts and the heavy denim pants stained with dark motor oil. I reached past the camouflage of my humble Southside mechanic disguise. Hanging securely in a thick protective garment bag was my custom-tailored midnight blue Italian suit. It was a masterpiece of fine wool that I had purchased in Milan 3 years ago, right after I officially acquired a massive European shipping fleet. It was meticulously tailored to fit my wide shoulders, completely hiding the physical toll of 40 years of hard labor, projecting absolute, undeniable corporate dominance. I pulled the heavy suit out and hung it carefully on the wooden door frame. I polished my expensive leather Oxford shoes that cost significantly more than the down payment on Reginald's leased cars. Tomorrow morning I was not going to fix a broken engine. I was going to war, and I was going to look exactly like the billionaire general that I truly am. Across the dark city, inside that incredibly tense, heavily mortgaged mansion, Reginald was sweating profusely in his formal dining room. He had secured my verbal, terrified promise for the massive bridge loan, but his desperate, greedy mind was racing out of absolute control. He paced back and forth across the expensive imported rug, drinking a glass of cheap tap water. He knew deep down that a simple $200,000 co-signed loan would only cover his violent street debts. It would temporarily save his kneecaps from the angry loan sharks, but it would not secure his fake luxurious lifestyle. It would not feed his demanding daughter, or replace the massive funds he had already stolen from the company pension. Kendra sat at the long dining table staring greedily at her own dark phone screen, furious that I had not begged for her forgiveness. "Why should we just take a small loan?" Daddy Kendra asked, her cold eyes narrowing with pure malicious greed. "He owns a massive property management company and that prime piece of real estate where his dirty garage sits. If he has the credit to back a huge loan, he has way more hidden money than we thought. We should take absolutely everything he has." Reginald stopped pacing instantly, his corrupt mind turning the dark, criminal gears. He looked at his spoiled daughter, a sick, predatory smile slowly forming on his sweaty face. "He is a very old man, Kendra." Reginald whispered, his voice dripping with pure, calculated evil. "He lives completely alone in that old, dusty house. He is clearly confused, and he acts incredibly erratic around normal people. If we legally declare him mentally unfit and completely senile, I could easily gain emergency conservatorship over his entire estate." It was a vicious, absolutely terrifying plot. They were actively planning to steal my entire life's work by legally declaring me insane and stripping away my basic human rights. Reginald immediately pulled out his expensive laptop, frantically searching for the private contact information of a corrupt, highly unethical judge that he had personally bribed in the past. "We need solid proof," Kendra Reginald instructed, typing rapidly on the quiet keys. "The corrupt judge will fast-track the heavy paperwork, but we need documented evidence that his mind is completely gone before the big board meeting tomorrow." Kendra smiled, a cold, wicked smile standing up from the heavy dining chair. "I will go visit him at his dirty little house first thing in the morning," Kendra volunteered smoothly. "I will put on my best maternity clothes. I will fake a massive emotional apology, and I will secretly record the entire conversation. I will make him sound completely confused, frail, and incredibly dangerous to himself. We will get that dirty old pig locked up in a state facility, and we will take every single dime he has been hiding from us." They thought they had hatched the perfect, unstoppable criminal scheme. They firmly believed I was a helpless, fragile old prey, ripe for the absolute taking. They had absolutely no idea that they were actively trying to put a cheap plastic leash on a fully grown silverback gorilla. The sun barely peeked over the heavy oak trees in my front yard, casting long, dark shadows across the porch. I was sitting at my kitchen table drinking a cup of black coffee, when I heard the heavy crunch of tires on my gravel driveway. I did not have to look out the window to know exactly who it was. The rented moving van they had used yesterday was gone, replaced by an expensive rideshare sedan. I watched the live feed from my discreet security cameras directly on my secure tablet. Kendra stepped out of the back seat carrying a large designer handbag and wearing a modest floral maternity dress. She had clearly spent hours scrubbing off her heavy makeup, trying desperately to look like a tired innocent and deeply concerned mother-to-be. She walked slowly up the wooden steps of my porch, clutching her oversized bee tightly against her side. I watched the camera feed closely, zooming in on the dark leather of her purse. There was a tiny, unnatural opening near the zipper, deliberately facing outward. She was hiding a digital recorder or her mobile phone on an active audio capture right inside the expensive leather bag. I smiled a cold, hard smile. The little spider was walking directly into my parlor, carrying her own sticky web, completely oblivious to the fact that she was the actual prey. I closed the security application on my tablet and slid it quietly under the morning newspaper. I stood up, adjusting my posture instantly. I dropped my wide shoulders, letting my spine curve slightly, practicing the exact physical look of a broken, exhausted, and incredibly senile old mechanic. I let out a heavy rattling sigh just as she knocked softly on the front door. I shuffled across the worn, hardwood floor, dragging my heavy work boots, deliberately making myself sound weak and incredibly unsteady. I opened the door slowly, blinking against the bright morning light as if I had absolutely no idea what day it was. Isaiah, Kendra said, her voice trembling with a perfectly rehearsed, entirely fake emotional break. "I'm so incredibly sorry to bother you this early, but I was just so deeply worried about you." I looked at her, keeping my eyes slightly vacant and completely out of focus. "Kendra," I mumbled, slurring my words just a tiny bit. "What are you doing here so early? Where's Marcus?" She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, pushing past me with a waft of expensive floral perfume. She immediately set her large designer handbag down on my kitchen table, making absolutely sure the small hidden opening was pointed directly at my face. She reached out, placing her soft manicured hands gently over my rough, calloused knuckles. "Marcus is resting at my father's house," she lied, squeezing my hands with a sickening display of fake affection. "He's just so incredibly stressed, Isaiah. But I could not sleep a single wink last night. I kept thinking about you living all alone in this big, dusty old house. You look so incredibly tired. Are you eating properly? Are you taking your daily medication?" I pulled my hands away slowly, pretending to be highly confused and slightly agitated by her sudden questions. "Medication?" I repeated, rubbing my forehead with a trembling hand. "I do not know. I think I took my pills yesterday, or maybe it was the day before. Everything is just so blurry lately, Kendra. My head hurts and I just cannot seem to remember where I put my important papers." Her eyes absolutely lit up with pure malicious joy, but she quickly hid it behind a mask of deep, fake sympathy. "Oh, Isaiah," she cooed, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "That is so terribly dangerous. You cannot live like this completely alone. You could easily hurt yourself or accidentally sign away your small house to a complete stranger. Daddy was telling me last night that you sounded highly confused on the phone. He said you were talking about borrowing massive amounts of money and you did not even know what day it was." She was actively feeding me the exact narrative she needed for the corrupt judge. She wanted me to agree on a recorded tape that I was financially irresponsible, highly confused, and legally incompetent. "Did I say that to Reginald?" I asked, letting my voice crack with perfectly faked helpless panic. "I do not remember talking to Reginald last night. Did I promise him my house? Kendra, please tell me I did not give away my little shop. The shop is all I have left in this world. I cannot lose my dirty little garage." She patted my shoulder, leaning in close to the hidden microphone in her bag. "It is going to be okay, Isaiah." she whispered, her tone incredibly condescending and completely evil. We are your family, and we are going to take absolute control of everything for you. You clearly have severe dementia, and you are not in your right mind at all. We will manage your properties and your little bank accounts, so you never have to worry your sick, broken head ever again. She was sealing her own massive doom, completely unaware that every single word she spoke was being captured by my high-definition hidden security cameras, recording in pristine audio and visual quality right above her greedy head. Marcus sat alone in the massive, silent living room of the leased mansion. His bare feet were wrapped in cheap bandages, throbbing with sharp pain from his long walk on the hot asphalt. His stomach growled loudly in the quiet, empty house. He stood up slowly, limping across the polished marble floor, desperately looking for a phone charger in his father-in-law's home office. The heavy wooden door was cracked open slightly. Marcus pushed it quietly, stepping into the dark, incredibly tense room. The large mahogany desk was covered in scattered papers and a half-empty glass of warm water. Marcus walked closer, his eyes catching the bold, heavy black ink on the top legal document. Emergency petition for conservatorship, it read clearly across the top. He leaned down, squinting in the dim light, reading the name of the respondent. Isaiah. His own father's name, printed on a document designed to completely strip a man of his basic human rights. Marcus picked up the thick stack of papers, his hands trembling violently. He read the terrible, completely fabricated claims. Severe dementia, chronic financial incompetence, and an absolute danger to his own physical safety. He stared at the terrible words, feeling a sudden intense wave of cold nausea wash over his empty stomach. He knew his father was not crazy. He knew his father was as sharp as a steel razor, a hardworking man who had simply finally demanded a drop of basic respect. Before Marcus could process the heavy gravity of the massive betrayal, the heavy iron gates outside buzzed loudly. He heard the heavy front door open, and Kendra rushed into the grand foyer, her high heels clicking rapidly on the marble floor. She sounded completely out of breath and incredibly excited. "Daddy," she called out loudly, her voice echoing in the empty leased mansion. "Daddy, come here right now. I have the absolute perfect recording." Reginald hurried out of the kitchen, wiping nervous sweat from his forehead. Marcus stood perfectly still in the dark office, listening to the terrible, venomous exchange through the cracked door. "I played him completely like a cheap fiddle," Kendra bragged, dropping her heavy designer bag onto a glass table. "He sounded absolutely pathetic, Daddy." He was slurring his old words, totally forgetting his own medications, and begging me not to take his dirty little garage away. He basically confessed on tape that he is completely losing his mind. Reginald let out a loud, booming laugh, a sound filled with pure, unadulterated evil. "That is absolutely brilliant, Kendra." Reginald cheered, clapping his large hands together. "This is exactly what we needed to trap the old mechanic. I will call my judge right now, and he will sign the emergency conservatorship papers before lunch. We will have total legal control over his bank accounts, the deed to his house, and the title to that filthy shop. We will have him locked away securely in a cheap state-run facility by Wednesday morning, and we will finally be rich again." Marcus felt his entire chest tighten, struggling desperately to pull air into his lungs. They were actually going to do it. They were going to steal everything his father had built with his own two bleeding hands and lock him away in a cold, lonely room for the rest of his natural life. Marcus pushed the heavy office door open completely, stepping out into the bright foyer. "You were going to put my dad in a nursing home?" Marcus asked, his voice shaking with a terrible, cowardly hesitation. Reginald and Kendra spun around instantly, completely shocked to see him standing there. Reginald recovered quickly, his fake, arrogant mask slipping right back into place. He walked over to Marcus, putting a heavy, dominant hand squarely on his shoulder. "Marcus, my boy." Reginald said smoothly, completely lying straight to his face. Your father is incredibly sick. His mind is totally gone. That is the exact reason he threw you out on the street yesterday. A sane, loving father would absolutely never do that to his own son. We are simply stepping in to protect the family assets and to make sure he gets the medical care he desperately needs. Marcus looked directly at Kendra. She walked over, placing her manicured hands gently on his chest, manipulating his absolute lowest weaknesses. Marcus, please listen to me, Kendra whispered, her eyes wide and entirely fake. Do you want to live on the cold street forever? Do you want our new baby to grow up in absolute poverty? This is the only way we can survive this terrible nightmare. Your father owes this to us. Marcus looked down at his bandaged, painful feet. He thought about the heavy, embarrassing garbage bags sitting on the curb. He thought about the terrifying reality of actually having to work for his own money. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against his mobile phone. He could call the police right now. He could dial his father's number and warn him about the massive illegal trap closing in around him. It was the absolute defining moment of his entire life, the exact moment to finally be a real man. But the heavy, crushing fear of hard work and the incredibly seductive promise of easy, unearned money completely overpowered his weak conscience. Marcus pulled his hand out of his pocket, leaving the phone entirely untouched. He looked at Reginald and he looked at his spoiled wife. He nodded his head slowly, fully accepting the terrible, unforgivable betrayal. Okay, Marcus, whispered his voice, incredibly small and entirely pathetic. Do whatever you have to do, just get our money back. He sold his own flesh and blood for the completely fake promise of a soft, unearned life. He walked back into the dark living room, completely ignoring the heavy, absolute silence of his own dying soul. Reginald sat behind his massive mahogany desk, a cold, predatory smile stretching across his sweaty face. The heavy, suffocating panic of the morning was completely gone. He looked at the small digital audio recorder resting right next to his empty glass of water. He reached out with thick, greedy fingers and pressed the small play button. The tiny speaker crackled to life, filling the dark office with the high-definition sound of my faked, broken voice. He listened to me, slurring my words, begging Kendra not to take my dirty little garage away. He heard the absolute pathetic helplessness in my tone, completely unaware that he was listening to a masterclass in psychological warfare. He is completely finished. Reginald whispered to himself, his chest puffing out with pure, unearned triumph. He picked up his mobile phone, dialing a private, unlisted number he kept securely locked in his contacts. It was a direct line to a highly corrupt, completely unethical county judge, a man who had accepted Reginald's heavy cash-filled envelopes many times in the past. The line rang twice before a low, gruff voice answered the quiet call. Judge Miller, Reginald said smoothly, leaning back comfortably in his expensive leather chair. I have a highly urgent, incredibly sensitive family matter that requires your immediate, discreet attention. It concerns an elderly relative who has completely lost his mental faculties and is currently a massive danger to his own estate. The corrupt judge let out a slow, knowing sigh. What exactly are we looking at, Reginald? The judge asked, his voice dripping with casual transactional greed. I am incredibly busy this week. My daily docket is completely full. I have an emergency petition for full conservatorship. Reginald explained, his voice speeding up with dark, criminal excitement. I have irrefutable recorded audio evidence of his severe dementia and his complete financial incompetence. I absolutely need the legal order signed and officially stamped before 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. There is a substantial, extremely generous campaign contribution waiting for you right now in my wall safe. There was a brief, heavy pause on the line as the corrupt official weighed the terrible crime against the heavy bribe. Have your legal courier drop the paperwork at my private residence tonight? The judge finally agreed, his moral compass completely broken by simple greed. The official order will be signed and legally binding by 8 in the morning. You will have total, absolute control over his entire estate. Reginald ended the quiet call, slamming his expensive phone down onto the polished wood, letting out a loud, booming laugh of pure, unadulterated victory. He felt like an absolute king, a brilliant, untouchable master of the entire city. He had successfully manipulated my own flesh and blood into complete submission. He had secured the fake medical evidence, and he had bought the absolute legal authority to steal my entire life of hard work. He stood up rapidly from his desk, walking over to the large, custom-built closet in the corner of his private office. He pulled open the heavy wooden doors, running his hands over the expensive imported fabrics of his custom-tailored suits. He selected a sharp, charcoal gray three-piece suit and a bright, blood-red silk tie. This was the exact armor he was going to wear when he walked into the main boardroom of Sterling Logistics tomorrow morning. He was going to sit down in the massive leather chair at the head of the long table, look the wealthy board of directors dead in the eye, and officially accept the powerful title of Chief Executive Officer. And right after that massive corporate victory, he was going to meet the dirty old mechanic and force me to sign the personal guarantor paperwork. He was going to use my small South Side house and my greasy little garage to pay off his violent underground loan sharks. Then, with the signed conservatorship order securely in his pocket, he was going to lock me away in a cheap, terrible state facility and drain every single hidden dime from my bank accounts. He walked over to the large wall mirror holding the expensive suit jacket up against his wide chest. He practiced his fake authoritative corporate smile, adjusting his posture to look incredibly dominant and powerful. He truly believed he had completely checkmated the simple mechanic. He firmly believed the dark, dangerous storm was entirely over and he was about to step into the bright, wealthy sunshine. He did not know that the audio recording he was so incredibly proud of was just the tiny bait on a massive, heavy steel hook. He did not know that his corrupt judge was already under deep investigation by my own ruthless legal team. He looked at his own reflection, completely blinded by his own massive, unearned arrogance. He was a dead man, walking meticulously, picking out the exact expensive suit he wanted to be legally buried in, completely unaware that the heavy grave was already dug and I was holding the only shovel. I sat in the quiet, heavy darkness of my home office, staring directly at the glowing screen of my secure laptop. The late afternoon sun cast long, deep shadows across the wooden floorboards. I opened the encrypted security application and pulled up the high-definition video files from the hidden cameras installed right above my front door and my kitchen table. The digital picture was absolutely crystal clear, capturing every single treacherous move my spoiled daughter-in-law had made that morning. I watched Kendra walk up my wooden steps, clutching her expensive leather handbag. The camera angle zoomed in perfectly, showing her deliberately unzipping the small side pocket, exposing the tiny black microphone of her digital recorder. I watched the video feed of my kitchen, seeing her set the bag down on the table, carefully aiming the hidden device right at my face. I listened to the crystal clear audio, captured by my own superior security system. I heard my own faked, slurring voice playing the role of the broken, senile mechanic. But more importantly, I heard her sharp, condescending whispers actively manipulating a man she believed was entirely helpless. It was the absolute perfect piece of undeniable counter-evidence. It was the exact heavy nail I needed to completely seal their corporate coffin. I reached over to my desk and picked up my mobile phone. I dialed the direct line for Vance, my corporate attorney. He answered on the very first ring, his voice crisp and strictly professional. "Vance," I said, leaning back in my heavy oak chair. "The little spider came to visit me today, exactly as we anticipated. She brought a hidden digital recorder and tried to trick me into confessing severe dementia." Vance let out a short, cold laugh on the other end of the line. "I assume you gave her exactly what she wanted," Isaiah Vance asked, his tone dripping with absolute legal anticipation. "I gave her a complete, undeniable masterpiece, Vance," I replied, keeping my voice incredibly steady. She thinks she has the absolute perfect audio evidence to legally strip my entire estate and lock me away in a state facility. But my hidden security cameras captured the entire deceptive setup in pristine, high-definition video and audio. I'm sending you the encrypted digital files right now. I clicked the heavy send button on my laptop, watching the massive video files transfer securely across the private network. I have them. Isaiah Vance confirmed the sound of rapid typing echoing over the phone line. This is absolutely devastating footage. It clearly shows premeditated elder abuse, criminal fraud, and a massive conspiracy to commit heavy extortion. Add it to the massive pile for the district attorney, I instructed firmly. But there is one more critical piece to their pathetic puzzle, Vance. Reginald needs a highly corrupt county judge to sign the emergency conservatorship order by tomorrow morning. He cannot do this legally, so he will absolutely try to bribe his way through the back door. Vance paused for a brief second, his legal mind working incredibly fast. I'm already completely ahead of you, Isaiah Vance said confidently. We have been actively monitoring his frequent communications with a disgraced county official named Judge Miller. We tipped off the State Judicial Ethics Board and the federal investigators early this morning. If Judge Miller signs a single piece of fraudulent paper for Reginald tonight, he will be arrested for severe judicial corruption right alongside his wealthy friend tomorrow. Excellent work, Vance, I said, feeling a deep, satisfying sense of absolute closure. They think they are actively hunting a wounded animal, but they are just marching blindly into a massive steel trap. The corporate boardroom is completely prepped for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, Vance reminded me, his voice tightening with pure aggressive energy. The entire board of directors will be seated. The local police detectives will be waiting quietly in the main lobby, and your private security detail is fully briefed. I looked over at the thick protective garment bag hanging on my closet door, holding my custom-tailored midnight blue Italian suit. I am ready, Vance, I said, my voice dropping into a low, heavy rumble. They wanted to play a terrible, greedy game with my life, and they completely destroyed my only son in the process. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to teach them exactly what happens when you try to steal from a man who built his own table. I ended the quiet call, placing the phone gently down on the polished wood. The house was incredibly still, but my mind was completely focused on the absolute execution of pure justice. I walked into the kitchen and poured the remaining cold coffee down the stainless steel sink. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or hesitation. When you raise a child, you hope they learn the deep value of hard work and the heavy price of basic respect. Marcus had chosen the easy, corrupt path of fake wealth, aligning himself with absolute thieves and arrogant liars. I went to bed early that night, sleeping completely soundly for the very first time in an entire week. The dark, heavy storm was finally here, and I was the absolute thunder. The heavy Atlanta humidity hung thick in the morning air as Monday finally arrived. Reginald stepped out of his leased luxury car right in front of the towering glass and steel headquarters of Sterling Logistics. He was wearing his expensive charcoal gray three-piece suit and a bright blood-red silk tie. He patted the inside breast pocket of his tailored jacket, feeling the thick, folded legal paper resting right against his chest. It was the emergency conservatorship order signed illegally at midnight by his highly corrupt county judge. Reginald felt like an absolute untouchable king. He walked through the massive revolving glass doors, completely ignoring the hard-working people around him. He strutted across the polished marble lobby, demanding absolute attention with every heavy step. A young female receptionist holding a stack of early morning mail accidentally stepped into his direct path. "Watch exactly where you are walking, girl," Reginald snapped harshly, not even slowing down his arrogant pace. "I am the new chief executive officer of this entire building, and I will not hesitate to replace you by lunchtime." The young woman stepped back quickly, her face pale with completely unearned fear. Reginald smiled a cruel, satisfied smile. He swiped his executive badge and stepped into the private glass-walled elevator, pressing the heavy metal button for the 45th floor. He watched the sprawling city of Atlanta shrink beneath him, fully believing he owned every single brick and paved road. He thought his violent underground loan sharks were essentially paid off. He thought his spoiled daughter and his useless son-in-law were completely secure. Most importantly, he thought the stubborn, dirty old mechanic from the South Side was about to walk into the boardroom and sign away his entire life. Reginald stepped out of the elevator onto the incredibly quiet, plush carpets of the executive floor. He walked straight toward the massive double mahogany doors of the main boardroom, ready to claim his fake stolen crown. Just 10 minutes later, a sleek extended black town car pulled up smoothly to the exact same corporate curb. I stepped out into the bright morning sun, feeling the heavy, undeniable weight of absolute justice settling onto my wide shoulders. I was not wearing faded flannel or oil-stained denim. I was wearing my custom-tailored midnight blue Italian suit, the fine wool draped perfectly projecting the exact intimidating presence of a man who owned entire shipping fleets. My expensive leather Oxfords clicked sharply against the pavement, completely replacing the heavy shuffle of my old work boots. Vance stepped out of the car right behind me, carrying a thick, heavy black leather briefcase. He was flanked seamlessly by two massive, highly trained private security contractors wearing dark suits and coiled earpieces. We did not walk toward the main entrance. We marched with the absolute terrifying precision of an advancing army. I pushed the reverse through the revolving glass doors, entering the massive marble lobby. The morning rush of busy corporate employees instantly parted like a massive sea, making a wide, clear path for us to walk through. I walked directly up to the main security desk. The head security guard, a man I knew personally from my detailed acquisition files, looked up from his computer screens. He started to ask for my identification, but his eyes suddenly went incredibly wide. He recognized my face from the wedding, but his brain could not process the massive, impossible transformation. He was looking at the dirty old pig wearing a suit that cost more than his yearly salary, flanked by the most ruthless corporate attorney in Atlanta. "Good morning," I said, my voice deep and completely steady. "We are heading up to the 45th floor for the emergency board of directors meeting." The guard swallowed hard, his hands shaking slightly as he unlocked the private executive turnstiles without asking for a single piece of paper. "Right this way, sir," the guard stammered, pointing a trembling finger toward the glass elevators. I nodded slightly, stepping past the heavy security desk. I glanced over at the main lobby waiting area. Sitting quietly on a leather bench, wearing completely plain clothes to blend in, were two local police detectives. They looked at Vance, and Vance gave them a very small, almost invisible nod. The heavy steel trap was fully primed and ready to snap shut. We stepped into the private executive elevator, the heavy silver doors sliding shut, completely sealing us in a quiet capsule of focused power. I watched the digital numbers climb rapidly, feeling the absolute cold clarity of a predator closing in on a highly arrogant, entirely clueless prey. I reached into my tailored pocket, letting my thumb rest against the small, crumpled $20 bill that Reginald had thrown at my feet just 2 nights ago. I was going to give it back to him today, right before I took absolutely everything else. The elevator chimed a soft, clear note, and the doors opened onto the 45th floor. The reception area was completely empty, the air thick with the heavy tension of the impending board meeting. Reginald was already inside the massive boardroom, probably sitting in my chair, practicing his completely fake, arrogant smile. I looked at Vance and I did not have to say a single word. He adjusted his grip on the heavy leather briefcase, fully loaded with the undeniable proof of Reginald's massive embezzlement and the high-definition counter-evidence of the pathetic conservatorship plot. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the final traces of the South Side mechanic fade away entirely. I walked toward the heavy double mahogany doors. I reached out, placing my large hands firmly on the polished brass handles. It was time to introduce the elite corporate board and the arrogant father of the bride to the absolute undisputed owner of Sterling Logistics. I pushed the heavy brass handles downward, and the massive mahogany doors swung open with a quiet, expensive click. But before I stepped fully into the room, I stood in the dark shadow of the hallway, listening to the absolute arrogance spilling out from the head of the long table. The boardroom was a sprawling monument to corporate excess lined with floor-to-ceiling glass and expensive leather chairs. Sitting right in the center, at the very head of the table, was Reginald. He was leaning forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood, looking at the 12 wealthy board of directors with a completely fake, confident smile. "Welcome, everyone," Reginald announced loudly, his voice echoing off the glass walls. "I want to thank you all for convening on such incredibly short notice this morning. As you know, we are entering a massive transition period, and the board has made the incredibly wise decision to officially appoint me as your new Chief Executive Officer." The board members sat completely in silence. They did not clap, and they did not smile. The chairwoman of this board, a stern woman with sharp eyes, looked down at her blank notepad. "We have not voted on that appointment yet," Reginald, the chairwoman, stated, her voice cool and strictly professional. "We are here to meet the new majority shareholder and to address the massive, glaring discrepancies in the regional treasury." Reginald waved his hand dismissively, completely brushing off her serious warning. "Those are just minor accounting errors," Reginald lied, smoothly adjusting his bright red silk tie. "I've already secured the private capital to completely bridge any divisional gaps. In fact, I have secured a massive personal guarantee from a private local investor." He reached into his tailored charcoal jacket, pulling out the heavily folded legal document. It was the fraudulent conservatorship order signed by his corrupt judge in the dead of the night. He placed it directly onto the polished table, tapping it with his thick fingers. Unfortunately, Reginald continued putting on a terrible fake mask of deep sympathy. "My private backer is an elderly man who has recently suffered a complete devastating mental collapse. He has severe dementia and is entirely unfit to manage his own massive estate." Reginald looked around the quiet room, soaking in the absolute stolen power. "But do not worry," Reginald assured them, his voice swelling with pure arrogant greed. "I have been granted full emergency legal conservatorship over his entire financial portfolio. I have absolute total control of his hidden bank accounts, his commercial real estate, and his private properties. The cash flow problem is entirely solved, and I'm fully ready to lead Sterling Logistics into a highly profitable new era." He was literally bragging about stealing an old man's life right in front of the highest corporate officers in the city. He thought he was untouchable. He thought the heavy, dark storm was over. I stepped out of the quiet shadows and walked directly into the bright, sunlit boardroom. My expensive leather Oxfords clicked sharply, echoing loudly against the polished, hardwood floor. The heavy mahogany doors swung completely shut behind me, sealing the massive room. Vance walked in right at my right shoulder, carrying the heavy black briefcase looking exactly like a lethal corporate executioner. The two massive security contractors stepped inside, standing perfectly still, blocking the only exit. The entire board of directors turned their heads instantly. They looked at my custom-tailored midnight blue Italian suit. They looked at the heavy, solid gold cufflinks flashing at my wrists. They looked at the deep, undeniable power radiating from my wide shoulders. They did not see a dirty mechanic, and they did not see a senile, broken old man. Reginald froze completely in his stolen chair. The fake, confident smile melted right off his sweaty face. He stared at me, his eyes widening in pure absolute horror. His brain simply could not process the impossible image standing right in front of him. He looked at the pristine, expensive wool of my suit, and then he looked at the heavy, intimidating presence of Vance. Isaiah Reginald gasped, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic squeak. What in the world are you doing here? You are supposed to be waiting in the lobby in your cheap work clothes. How did you get past the ground floor security? I did not stop walking. I marched straight down the long side of the massive table, my eyes locked directly onto his terrified, sweaty face. I walked with the heavy, unbending posture of a man who had spent 40 years building a literal empire with his bare hands. I did not come here to wait in the lobby, Reginald, I said, my voice dropping into a low, terrifying rumble that shook the crystal water glasses on the table. And I absolutely did not come here to co-sign a pathetic loan for a violent street thug. I reached the head of the massive table. I stood right over him, looking down at the heavy, fraudulent conservatorship paper he had just bragged about. I reached into my tailored pocket and pulled out the crumpled, dirty $20 bill. I tossed it gently onto the polished wood, letting it land right on top of his fake legal document. I came here to return your cheap gas money, I stated, firmly keeping my cold eyes fixed on his panicked face. And I came here to formally accept your immediate resignation. The heavy silence in the boardroom was absolute. Reginald stared at the crumpled $20 bill, and then he looked up at my face. His eyes were wide, darting frantically around the massive room. This is a complete joke, Reginald sputtered, his voice trembling with a mix of cold fear and sudden desperate anger. Security, he yelled, looking wildly toward the heavy mahogany doors. Someone call the lobby security right now. This crazy old mechanic is trespassing in my corporate office. The 12 wealthy board members did not move a single muscle. They did not reach for their expensive phones, and they did not look at me with disgust. They looked at Reginald with a mixture of pure pity and absolute horror. The chairwoman of the board, the stern woman with the sharp eyes, picked up a thick file that Vance had quietly slid across the polished table. She opened the heavy folder, scanning the top page with a completely unreadable expression. Then she looked up, looking directly past Reginald and locking her eyes onto mine. "Good morning, Mr. Isaiah," the chairwoman said, her voice dripping with profound professional respect. "The board officially acknowledges your complete acquisition of Sterling Logistics. We have fully verified the massive transaction with the federal regulators. The absolute transfer of ownership was finalized at exactly 6 o'clock this morning." Reginald flinched violently as if she had physically slapped him across his sweaty face. "What are you talking about?" Reginald gasped, his hands gripping the leather armrests so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. "Acquisition." He repeated, his brain completely short-circuiting in real time. "That is absolutely impossible. The corporate stock has not moved a single inch today. I monitor the active markets every single morning. It was a strictly private acquisition." "Reginald," I explained, my voice calm and incredibly lethal. "I bought your outstanding massive debt. I bought the majority shares from the quiet, silent partners you completely ignored. I even bought the massive bank that holds the heavy note on this very building. I did not just buy the logistics company. I bought the actual ground you are standing on right now." Reginald shook his head rapidly, his mind completely rejecting the crushing reality. "No," Reginald shouted, pushing himself up from the heavy leather chair. "No, you are a dirty, broke mechanic. You drive a rusted-out piece of junk truck. My daughter called you a broke pig on a public microphone, and you sat by the kitchen doors eating cheap food. You absolutely cannot be a billionaire. Billionaires do not have black engine grease under their fingernails." I leaned forward, placing both of my large hands flat on the expensive polished wood. I leaned in so close I could smell the sour, terrified sweat pouring off his dark face. "I earned every single dollar I have, Reginald," I stated, my voice echoing like heavy thunder in the quiet room. "I built my massive empire with hard sweat and thick grease. I absolutely know the deep value of a dollar because I had to bleed for it. You think money is just magic. You think it appears in your account because you wear a fancy custom suit and act like a king. You think you can spend it recklessly because you have a fake corporate title. But you completely forgot the most important rule of business. You never insult the man who actually signs the checks. Vance stepped forward, opening his heavy black leather briefcase with a sharp, terrifying click. Mr. Reginald Vance announced, his tone clinical and completely merciless. This man is Isaiah, the founder and sole absolute proprietor of IM Logistics. As of this exact morning, he is the new chairman of the board and the complete owner of this entire corporate entity. Reginald slumped back down into the chair, his weak legs completely failing him. He looked like a deflated balloon, all of his fake, unearned arrogance entirely punctured. He looked at the wealthy board members, desperately seeking a single friendly face, seeking someone to tell him it was all a bad dream. But the powerful directors just stared back at him, their faces completely turned to cold stone. "Get out of my chair, Reginald," I commanded quietly, pointing a thick finger toward the side of the massive room. "That is the chairman's seat, and you are officially sitting in my spot." Reginald hesitated for a split second, a tiny flicker of foolish pride trying to spark in his chest. But the absolute crushing weight of my presence completely extinguished it. He slowly stood up, letting go of the expensive leather armrests. He stepped away from the massive chair, looking incredibly small and entirely pathetic in his wrinkled custom suit. I walked around the edge of the table and I sat down in the heavy leather seat. It was incredibly comfortable, solid, and built for a man who knew exactly how to carry heavy weight. I folded my hands together, looking down the long length of the corporate table. "Now," I said, shifting my cold gaze directly onto Reginald, who was standing awkwardly near the glass window. "Let us have a very serious talk about the massive, illegal plots you hatched against me and the terrible crimes you committed against your own hardworking employees." I looked down at the fraudulent legal document resting right next to his cheap $20 bill. "You stood in this massive room, Reginald, and you proudly told these wealthy directors that I was a broken, senile old man. You told them my mind was completely gone and you had secured emergency legal conservatorship over my entire estate." Reginald swallowed hard, his throat clicking loudly in the dead silence. "It is the absolute truth," Reginald stammered, pointing a violently shaking finger at the thick paper. "You are completely crazy, Isaiah. You did not even know what day it was when my daughter came to check on you." I nodded slowly, signaling to Vance with a very slight movement of my right hand. Vance reached into his heavy black briefcase and pulled out a small digital remote. He pressed a single silver button, and the massive, flat screen monitor at the far end of the boardroom hummed quietly to life. "Let us take a very close look at exactly how crazy I truly am." "Reginald," I said, keeping my voice incredibly flat and dangerous. The large digital screen flickered brightly, showing the crystal-clear, high-definition security footage from my quiet front porch. The wealthy board members turned their expensive leather chairs, completely captivated by the sudden digital presentation. The video played smoothly, showing Kendra walking up my wooden steps. The pristine audio quality captured the exact moment she unzipped her designer handbag, intentionally exposing the tiny black digital microphone. The board members gasped softly, instantly recognizing the highly deceptive, incredibly calculated move. The scene quickly cut to my small kitchen. The massive boardroom speakers amplified Kendra's voice with absolute undeniable clarity. They heard her fake, sickeningly sweet tone trying desperately to manipulate me. Then they heard the incredibly cruel, highly criminal whisper that completely sealed her terrible fate. "We are your family," Kendra's recorded voice echoed loudly off the thick glass walls, "and we are going to take absolute control of everything for you. You clearly have severe dementia. We will manage your properties and your little bank accounts so you never have to worry your sick, broken head ever again." The video paused right on her cold, malicious smile. The heavy silence in the boardroom returned, but this time it was filled with absolute, profound disgust. The elite directors looked at Reginald, seeing the exact venomous snake he truly was. He had not just lied to them about his massive corporate wealth. He had actively conspired to steal a healthy man's entire life by faking a terrible medical condition and bribing a highly corrupt county judge. Reginald was physically shaking now, his custom charcoal suit feeling like a heavy, suffocating straitjacket. "That is completely manipulated audio," Reginald choked out, taking a very weak step backward toward the thick glass windows. "That is entirely fake. You completely edited that video to frame my innocent, pregnant daughter." Vance did not even look up from his extensive legal notes. "We actively forwarded the completely unedited original digital files directly to the district attorney this morning," Vance stated coldly, his voice completely devoid of any sympathy. "Furthermore, we alerted the State Judicial Ethics Board about your highly illegal midnight meeting with Judge Miller. The federal authorities raided his private residence at 6 o'clock this morning. Your corrupt judge is currently sitting in a cold holding cell, completely cooperating with the heavy federal investigation." Reginald felt the absolute floor drop completely out from under his expensive leather shoes. The massive, brilliant criminal trap he thought he had perfectly engineered was actually a giant, incredibly tight steel cage dropping straight down on his own head. He had absolutely no leverage left. His corporate cards were frozen, his private bank accounts were completely empty, and his illegal court order was entirely worthless paper. "You actively tried to declare me legally incompetent, Reginald," I said, leaning back comfortably in the massive leather chairman's seat. "You tried to lock a hard-working, honest man in a terrible state facility just so you could steal my small house and pay off your incredibly violent street debts. You thought I was just a simple, foolish prey, but you completely forgot to ask yourself exactly how a simple Southside mechanic ended up sitting at the absolute head of your corporate table." The chairwoman of the board spoke up, her sharp voice cutting right through Reginald's heavy, panicked breathing. "This is absolutely despicable, Reginald," the chairwoman declared, her face twisted in pure professional revulsion. "You have completely disgraced this entire corporate institution. We trusted you to manage our regional divisions, and you operated like a highly dangerous, desperate street criminal." Reginald looked around the massive room, his eyes darting frantically from face to face. He was looking for a single drop of mercy, a tiny ounce of forgiveness from the people he used to actively bully and brag to. He found absolutely nothing. He was entirely alone, stripped of his fake power and completely exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of pure justice. I looked at Reginald shivering by the thick glass windows, and I shook my head slowly.